you know, Shadowcliff is, the lodges are shut down for this season, which was, you know, unfortunate, but the healthy, wise choice that we unfortunately had to make as a board. So due to that, we, you know, we still have this amazing community and network of people that are kind of spread across the globe, really, and we wanted to find ways to connect with our community and to offer them some sort of content, programming, and online is the way to do that right now. So we are exploring this communiversity model, which is basically knowledge and skill sharing and story sharing just between folks within our extended network. So we're offering several, well, like about a month of different online sessions led by various folks like past speakers, group leaders, past volunteers, guests who have just either skills, knowledge, or stories to share. And there's different formats. This is going to be some learning, some discussion. Some folks are doing music, presentations. So kind of a mix of different topics, but it's been a fun new thing to pilot this year, and we're really excited about it. So that's a little rundown.
Thank you, Kelly. So I think especially since we're starting a little late, I will just, Harvey, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we are recording now, so feel free to do your screen sharing as you need to, and others will come in as they come in. And will you just say a little bit about your connection to Shadowcliff, Harvey, and introduce yourself in terms of your interest in doing this with us?
Yeah, I started co-leading workshops at Shadowcliff probably over 10 years ago, mostly with Bob Mann, and really so appreciated and fell in love with the center, the retreat center, as a center, never mind physically, the beauty of it and the mission and the vision of it, that I've been kind of an outlier. In the Shadowcliff solar system, I'm probably Neptune. I've sat in a lot of different meetings and groups to planning, strategic planning, but mostly it's been the teaching of the workshops and met such wonderful people there. So when you decided to have the Communiversity, I said, sure, I'd love to do this. Give me a chance to talk about what I'm doing and to help you all with this webinar. So what I'd like to do here is I'm going to show some slides. I want to go to some websites. I want to talk some about the project. And I wanted to start off with, very quickly, I'm curious, where were you born? Where did you grow up? Where do you live now? Okay. And what would you like from this? What is it you're interested in? What attracted you to this? And what would be useful for you to learn from this? So I make sure that I address it. And if somebody would start, I'll give mine, but then I want to use that as the lead in to talk about some other things.
Well, I can start, and I'll just suggest that maybe we all, since some of us know each other, but we don't all know each other, that we, say our name and how we're connected. So I'm Kathy Baldwin, and I'm the executive director of Shadowcliff. And I was born in Montana. I grew up in Kansas City, and I live in New Mexico. I see, Deborah, you're switching gears on your device. That's fine. And then let's see. So, well, what drew me to this is partly because I wanted to support the process of, this pilot, and so I'm doing it from the Shadowcliff perspective. But I'm also very interested in what you're going to be sharing about these kinds of stories and how they may impact, or how they potentially impact, the upcoming elections, which is kind of a critical juncture in my view.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Kelly?
Yeah, I can go next. Good question. So I'm Kelly Yarbrough. I was born in Plano, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas.
Oh, yes.
And I currently live, I grew up there as well. And I currently live in Manhattan, Kansas. So I like to tell people I'm a Kansan by choice. And really, I mean, that kind of plays into why I'm here too, I think, because I've lived in Manhattan for, I guess, 7 years or so now. And so this is kind of the community where I feel like I've really been putting down roots in my more recent years, I guess, and being able to participate more in the community and have peers and friends that are doing really positive things to influence our community. And so I'm jazzed by all the good examples that I see around me of people in civic roles or making change for the better. And so I guess what I hope to get out of this session is I'm interested in learning some of the historical aspects of what you're gonna talk about, and how some other positive examples in history, I guess, and then just being able to notice those good things happening around me and encourage and compound on those positive things, I guess.
Great. Thank you. Deborah?
I know. Can you hear me? I'm on a different device.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
I'm Deborah Tuttenauer. I was born in New York, outside of New York City. I'm from Crested Butte, Colorado, where I've lived since 1995, and I've spent the last year in Ventura, California, and hoping to get back home. Was planning on being back home this fall, but probably now not for another year. And honestly, I actually do have no idea what this webinar is about, except that Michael told me Harvey was doing a webinar, and I've always loved talking with Harvey, and I am so incredibly intellectually bored, and I don't know any people in Ventura. So the only people I literally see is my 18-year-old daughter and my husband and my dog, and friends that I talk to long distance, and the opportunity to be part of something with some other intelligent people, regardless of what it is what made me show up. So I'm really curious what Harvey's going to be talking about. And
Yeah, me too.
and just excited to just, do something because I barely leave the house and haven't since the end of February. So, except to go for walks. So, yeah, there you go.
Okay, thank you. Gwen, are you there?
I turned my video off because I'm not sure about my connection right now. So
Yeah.
Let me know if I sound spotty. I can always call in on my cell phone too. I am here because of a long history with Shadowcliff as well. I've been volunteering and was on the board for a while and involved with Shadowcliff over the last 25 years. Also through Bob Mann, I worked at Bridging the Gap with him. I was born in Lakewood, Ohio, suburb just west of Cleveland, Ohio. So I'm a Rust Belt kid, kind of scrappy. And I left home at 18 and traveled the world. So I lived in Europe, New York, other parts of the United States, and landed in Kansas City because of a relationship to a man at Hallmark Cards. So it was a good landing. I love Kansas City. I am now located in the Flint Hills of Kansas on a ranch, taking care of 21 bison and 3 dogs and my husband. It's good. And we're both dedicated to conservation. So he works for the Nature Conservancy. That's how we met. I worked in Latin America for 14 years. And now I've made a transition to Tompkins Conservation. So, working in Chile, Argentina, and North America, and our headquarters in the U.S. is out in San Francisco. So I have quite a few friends now out in California. The reason this intrigues me is because living rural it's not super new for me. I've been out here for about 13 years in rural Kansas. Have a small restaurant here that's really popular, so it's fun to be a part of like entrepreneurism and community development work here, but I find myself not able to facilitate difficult conversations easily. And by easily, I don't mean like making it easy. I mean, I would love to have diverse groups of people together, whether that's from Kansas City, urban area, and rural Kansas, to discuss some of these crisis issues that we're facing, and to have very intellectual sound dialogue that involve politics. And right now it's so divided here that we find ourselves in very careful, either super polite and superficial conversations with people that may not have the same political persuasions as my husband and I, or people just are not talking, or it's in your face, no agreement, and using, for example, face masks as the weapon. So I want to learn how to facilitate better and have more dialogue that is respectful, but also moves to action. That's not just a polite discussion and then we all leave. Tompkins Conservation has given me a great platform to do that. It's a pretty vocal organization. We're very tied to Patagonia, the corporation, and so we take some political stances, and we also have advocacy as part of our mission. So that's given me a little bit more of a platform, but my husband's scared to death it could put us in danger in rural Kansas. So we'll see what happens there. That's kind of a sarcastic comment, but also has a little bit of truth in it. So that's why I'm here. I'm excited to get to know you all better.
Great. Thank you, Gwen. So I grew up in Boston. I was born in Boston and grew up in Boston, and went to college just outside of Boston, about 15 miles outside. And then moved out west, went to Texas, and I lived most of my adult life in Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, all of which I have loved, all three places. And I asked the questions because as part of this, as I've gotten involved in this project over the last year, close to a year and a half, I kept asking myself and looking at what is my own political bio? How do I come to the beliefs that I have and the opinions that I have and the positions that I take? How have I come to those over the years? And I find it very interesting. I mean, my parents were very apolitical. I mean, I was born at the very end of, this is hard to admit, but the very end of World War II, which is better than being born at the very end of World War I at this stage of life. But and I grew up in a basically Jewish, my mother was an immigrant, and Jewish family that kept their heads down and did not get themselves, never involved themselves in anything political that I ever knew of, and I don't think they did. They'd read the newspapers and they'd be up on current events. But that was really it. And we never had, I was the only child, we never had political discussions around the house. And so the formative years at home was hardly, it was nothing basically. Then there was really nothing in school. And the media, what I remember is, I can remember some of the McCarthy Army hearings in Congress and that whole McCarthy period. But I don't remember my parents ever discussing politics growing up. And so I'm wondering, did you have political families with conversations? Did you have them around the dinner table? Were you aware of what's going on in the world?
I grew up in just this generation after you. Then I was in the late 60s and early 70s, and there was a lot going on, and there was a lot of conversation in my household about what was going on. A lot of kind of activism language, is I guess what I would call it.
Yeah. Deborah? Yeah. You can just talk. Yeah. I don't need to call on people's name.
There we
just,
go.
Yeah.
You know, I'm trying to put myself back. So you're in the generation between my parents and me. So my parents are in their mid 80s now, and I was born in the 50s. So during the 60s, like when I was a teenager in the 70s, I felt like I was born 10 years too late. Like I missed the stuff, right? Like I missed all of it. And my family has incredible political, very heated political, like, New York Jewish, everyone talking over each other, yelling and waving their hands, political conversations all the time. But I do not remember that as a kid. I was the oldest of three. I think my parents were pretty overwhelmed with just having a household of children. And I do not remember having political or current events conversations at the dinner table until all of us were grown-ups, like until, I was in my 20s. And I think when you ask that question, I think that's surprising given how intense the political conversations have been in my entire adult life, particularly with my father, who is just very, very strong in his political beliefs on different topics, and one of the best arguers and debaters you will ever come across. To the point where everyone's screaming, and my husband's like, "Oh my God, do you guys all hate each other?" I'm like, "No, this is how we talk," But growing up, I don't remember that. I don't remember as a kid talking about what was going on in the 60s on TV when I was 10 years old and it was like, 1969. I do not remember that at all.
My parents, well, I was an only child until I was 16, and then I had siblings, but so my parents always encouraged education and reading, but any political conversations weren't really conversations or discussions. I mean, I grew up in a pretty conservative Christian household, so current events were discussed as a matter of like, let me inform you on the right perspective on this. So
how'd that go over?
I mean, I look at it
I'm
as
sorry, I'm just
thinking back, I mean, like, I didn't really find my own questions and voice really until I left home. So and conversations since then have been to varying degrees of success. Success, it depends on how you define success, I guess, but we have different views now.
Yeah. Most of us probably do with our parents.
Awesome.
And Gwen,
I was born during the Tet Offensive in 1968. And I remember growing up with an aunt who was very politically involved, and she was kind of my big sister. I think she was 14 or 15 when I was born. So, but my family is more like, we grew up kind of formally in this Republican household, but I remember thinking it was focused more on being fiscally responsible. Like, I remember my dad taking me, when I told him I wanted to open a cafe or restaurant someday, he took me when I was about 9 years old to open my savings account and how to be responsible and how to learn how to do a checking account really young. And it was really fun. And then I would say our social political sway was more toward how the Democrats are. Like, it was very focused. We all loved Jimmy Carter. We were like always volunteering, always socially engaged, but never like really in a strong, like, you have to be Republican, you have to be Democrat kind of way. It was like, you need to be fiscally responsible. And this is why we like some of the Republican Party type of values at that time. And then we want to be socially and care about things like diversity in our family. And so this is why we agree with these values. And so it was really fun. It felt like it was a big blend. As I got older, things started getting divided really quickly. Our family divided into Dems and Republicans and the ugly parts of the how you use politics. So to the point where, like, when Obama was in office, when he was being elected, my dad like broke off from the family and broke off communications because he was challenged by having a Black president. And we all were excited. All the younger generation folks in our family were excited. And he stopped talking with a bunch of us. I mean, it was just odd. And I see that being more and more divided as we go forward. My mom has stopped talking about anything about politics. And to the point where we don't bring up anything for the real reason that people will stop communicating in my family. Sometimes for a long period. My dad didn't talk to me for about 3 years over politics. So it's rough. It's really hard to see that happening in the family right now.
Yeah, and in so many families right now. So thank you all for that. Just to continue a little of my own political evolution, because it really is the background for this whole project, is I started to wake up when I went to college. I went to Brandeis, which is about 15 miles outside of Boston, and was a very progressive school. So that, for instance, about 1 month after I got there, my freshman year, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there were these big assemblies. And I remember the school allowing even one of the teachers who got up and talked about Cuba shall rise and America shall fall. And there were just as many conservative opinions as well, but the school allowed a really breadth of political opinion. So my freshman year, among others, I heard James Baldwin speak. I heard Martin Luther King speak. I heard Gus Hall, who was the president of the Communist Party of the United States. And probably the one that influenced me the most was Malcolm X. That I remember sitting in the back row of a huge hall, like 500 people in the hall. And I usually sat in the back row in most, classes and lectures whenever I could. And him feeling like he was just so in my face talking to me. And it has influenced me tremendously over the years. And then at some point, I started tutoring some African-American kids in a ghetto. And gradually, my political awareness and evolution evolved and got shaped. I remember spending a year in a class called Civil Liberties in America that was taught by Max Lerner, who was a Russian immigrant who became a very liberal columnist for the Washington Post for many years. And that was just fascinating, that class. And it really shaped me in many ways. Then I went to Texas for graduate school, and I went to Texas in 1966, and the war was starting to get very serious, and the president was Lyndon Johnson, who his ranch was just 90 miles south of where I and many others were, and I got involved in a lot of the politics in Austin, which was, thank God, was a pretty liberal city to allow us to do what we did. We put out an underground newspaper, quote underground, wasn't really, got involved in a lot of the demonstrations, some of the very first love-ins on military bases. And so suddenly here I was, my hair was now down on my shoulders, and the beard somehow grew out. I had the cigar too. I had the whole Che look for a while there. And it was wonderful. My life really opened up in that period. And then I moved to Colorado to do an internship and kind of continued a lot of that. But I got shaped because when I was 16 in the 1960 election, John Kennedy, who was my senator from Massachusetts, was elected. And that was a whole excitement. And for the first time, really looking at national politics, even though I couldn't vote in that election. But it got me engaged in it. And then, of course, all the things that happened, the assassinations in the 60s and the drugs in the 60s, and, et cetera, all have contributed. And as I've watched how the country has changed and really started to see how the difference in politics, which were very rough in the 50s anyway, in the whole McCarthy era, as I'm sure you all know, somehow broadened in the 60s and got a little saner. And even to the 70s and into the 80s. In fact, I have a friend of mine who was in Congress. She was a representative from Rhode Island for 10 years in Congress. She's a Republican, And she wrote most of the progressive women's legislation, environmental legislation, water legislation while she was there. And I remember her telling stories about how, for instance, the president was Reagan for most of the time that she was in the House. And Reagan wanted, for instance, increase the budget for more nuclear funding, right? And she wouldn't vote for that, right? And she would get a call from George Bush, who was the vice president at the time. And it would be kind of like, oh, come on, sure, you can vote for this. And she would say, no, I can't do this. I just don't believe in this. And the response would be something like, oh, okay, don't worry about it. And then, you know, in that period, starting in the 80s and certainly in the 90s with the contract with America with Newt Gingrich in 92 and in the last, you know, basically in that last 20 years, what we've watched is the incredible polarization as the country has gotten more and more divided. And we now truly live, as you know, in a house divided by itself, and the beams are creaking, and it scares me. And like probably all of you and millions of others, 4 years ago in the election with Clinton and Trump, in which I was so sure she was going to win that I didn't do very much. I canvassed a couple of days, which was a waste of time. At the very end of the election, nobody was home, nobody wanted to talk. Everybody made up their minds by then. And then not only there was the surprise of Trump winning and feeling like I'd just been kicked in the head and kicked in the gut and kicked, you know, all over. But then there was the added, in a sense of, my God, I didn't do anything really to help in that campaign because I was so sure that she was going to win. So out of that came when Trump won, Trump got inaugurated. I actually stopped watching the news for a couple of years because I have a background in psychology as well as a fascination over the years of politics. And those two don't go together when you have somebody like Trump in office to understand what's possible. But I made the decision and I said, okay, I got to get it. If he's going to run again, which of course he started in his inauguration with running again, to said, I got to do something in this election. And, you know, then what? And I'd looked at somebody, we lose an audio. Is that Mike? Maybe that's Michael. Michael? I guess she's calling in right now. So I started looking at elections, and you know, historically, again, I don't do a history lesson or anything here, but I was fascinated by the history of elections. And if you go back to George Washington in his farewell speech, the two things he warned about were entanglement with foreign governments, and the second thing were political parties, which were entanglements basically with other Americans. And despite his warning, as soon as he was out of office, we had some of the most vicious campaigns in American history between, for instance, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. I mean, it was in some sense, far worse than what goes on now. But of course, it was much more limited because the media was so much more limited at the time. But they all had their own newspapers, and they lied about each other, and they made statements like, you know, Jefferson would make statements about how John Adams would restore the monarchy, and it was pretty vicious. And that has really gone on through most of American history. Abraham Lincoln was on the receiving end of some of the most vicious campaigns in American history. And it wasn't really until after World War II, where, and I was talking about a little earlier, particularly when you get into the later 60s and 70s and for a good part of the 80s, where it basically calmed down. You had a development of the middle class in this country. You had more people who were from the middle class in Congress. And many of the people, particularly the men, had fought together in World War II. And if they hadn't been in the same units or fighting in Europe or fighting in the Pacific, they knew that so many of the others in Congress had also fought in the war. And they stayed in Washington. They were often friends. There's famous stories of Tip O'Neill, as Speaker of the House, was a Democrat, and Reagan, as the president, would get together and have a drink every once in a while and talk about what's going on in the country. there was a civility to it that went on for about 20 years until we started this kind of decline. So given all of that, my question then was, okay, if I'm going to do something in this election, what the hell am I going to do? And what can I do that might make a difference? And most people, when they're asked to do something or want to do something in an election, it really comes down to three main things. One is work the phone banks, which I can't do. I've done some of that. It's just that, you know, it doesn't yield very much. I don't think. Maybe a campaign manager would disagree. Or knock on doors, you know, which is also not my strong suit, even though I tried selling encyclopedias when I was a kid, and that lasted about a day and a half. And the third one is raise money, which I'm not very good at raising money. So I said, okay, what can I do? So I looked at my own background, which have been a writer, a speaker, and a trainer. I've done all three in a variety of different settings, leading large group personal growth weekends. I was a contract speechwriter for Apple and Sony and Visa, IBM for 15 years. I got to really understand about multinational corporations. I've run my own business. I worked a year and a half as a contractor to the World Bank, doing climate change training videos for them. So I've done a variety of things, but the common thread in all of those was, how do you take complex material and how do you basically craft it into a story that engages people and moves them to take action, whether that's buy my product, implement my program, vote for me, etc. It's the same idea. And when I started, you know, saying, okay, what do I have to offer? I said, well, that's exactly what a campaign is about. That's what an election is about engaging people and getting them to do something, which is to show up on election day or send in an absentee ballot these days and vote. So I said, okay, well, how can I then use those skills? Is there something that I can do with campaigns and with electoral support organizations, meaning groups like League of Women Voters, League of Conservation Voters, you know, youth groups, voter registration groups, all of whom are in some way or another supporting the electoral process if they're not an actual campaign. And so that started me saying, okay, well, how are campaigns run? I mean, what would you say, just to break up the, you know, have some conversation, what do you think are the main elements of a typical campaign these days and in the last 20 years, say? What would you say the formula is? I'm going to argue there's a formula.
Well, I'm not super knowledgeable on this, and I think it probably looks a little bit different depending on what level your election you're looking at, you know. But
yeah,
I think, you know, common threads, like you need your platform, and these days it seems like even just having a few key messages that you can just harp on over and over and over again, whether you're very knowledgeable about all the issues or not, just having a few key things, that hot button topics that people respond to seem to be important. And getting those sound bites, man. The clickable links and the
shorter the better. Yeah.
Branding seems to be huge.
Yep.
I was going to say too that sometimes it seems like part of the formula, maybe, I haven't thought about it as a formula, but part of it is that you don't necessarily bring forward what you as a candidate think or believe or will do, but you point at the other person, whoever is your opponent, and sort of pick that person apart in some way, whether it's a personal issue or some political issue, but it's almost more like tear down the opposition as versus present your own platform.
Yep. Deborah Gren, you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, I think that you know, I think that you know, that social media, I think, changed many things about a campaign, and you know, I think when Obama brought his campaign online and did so well with social media and having just an army of people, of young people all around the country and learning to use the platforms in a way that hadn't been used before, I think that shifted the way campaigns were done from something that was about the news to something that was almost more akin to entertainment. And I think that's actually why Donald Trump won, because he's an entertainer, and there's a game in marketing with engaging the emotions of your audience. And you know, those of us who think we're sort of like intellectually above that, and politics should be about you know, issues, and it should be about change, and it should be about making the country better, and you know, whatever our values are,
Yep.
you know, our liberal values or whatever, from probably the people on this group, or in the reality of the actual campaign, it doesn't seem to me to be that anymore. It seems to be advertising, and it seems to be entertaining, and it seems to be performing. And actually, even though people, if you poll them, say that the issues are important, people are not tending to vote, at least in past elections, you know, in the last 15, 20 years, they're not voting necessarily on issues. They're voting on, like, you know, who's the best entertainer, or who looks the best, or who's the friendliest. Or, I mean, I think part of the reason Hillary lost is because there was this whole marketing campaign around making her not friendly, you know, but it had nothing to do with who she really was, and nothing to do with the politics or the policies or the ability to be a good president. You know, I think back to my grandfather talking about politics, and, you know, it seemed like politicians back in those days, people talked about the policies because they couldn't see the people. You know, they read what their policies were, and they heard about them on the radio, or they heard them speak on the radio, but it wasn't like all the constant blasting of social media and sound bites and video bites and all kinds of things that are really appealing to the baser emotions of people, rather than the intellectual thought process of who do we want to run our country or our city or our town or our state or whatever.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Gwen and Michael, do you want to add anything?
No, thank you.
I think just a short comment. Everything Deborah said, I really agree with, and it hits home. And I think that, like, what keeps me up at night is the lack of the deep education of ourselves as communities. We go on the sound bites, and then we repeat them, and then they're up in signs, like across I-70 on semi-tractors. Like, I'm like, oh my gosh, are we really that stupid as a population of people? And I hate to say that. But it's just like, and I don't know if it's that people are overwhelmed with the inflow of information and messaging everywhere, and exactly to Deborah's point, the advertising, right? It's marketing and advertising that's hitting us, not deep, thoughtful conversation and getting to know the people better. It's rough. It's really rough.
Yeah. So yeah, I think all those things are, you know, quite accurate. And the formula I mentioned, as I look at campaigns, is that basically it's a three-part formula, which we pretty much have touched upon here. One is excite the base. And you do this in an advertising way. You touch on certain issues, you get great sound bites, all of that. But basically what you want to do is excite the base. The second thing you want to do is you want to demonize the opposition. So how good we are, how bad they are. And the third thing is you want to siphon off enough independents to win the election. And particularly at the presidential election, because there really are, depending on the level, it's quite different. But certainly at the presidential and the national level, like for Congress, often those races are decided by just a couple of percentage points. So it's important to siphon them off. So when I looked at that, I said, God, you know, is that all there is to it? I mean, there's all these variations on it, but there's got to be another way to excite voters other than either just hitting all the hot buttons, Medicare for all, or gun reform, whatever the particular hot button issues, or electing conservative judges. This is true of any party, that does the same thing, or just demonizing either their character or their policies, which of course is so prevalent. Isn't there another way to excite voters? And so when I looked at the campaigns again, it seemed like what candidates talk about, the large majority of their, whether it's their speeches, their videos, their website materials, their leave behind materials, their robo-phone calls, is what I call the 3 Ps. And what they do are platitudes. We must do this. We have to do this. We need to do that. Okay? And then there are promises, many of which are ridiculous, like we're going to have 100% renewable energy in the United States by 2030. I think it's ridiculous that we have 100%. Right? Be a hell of a lot closer to that. Right? But there are these promises about what they're going to do, many of which they have not the legal authority to do because they're only the president, they're not a Congress, and Congress has to make laws. And then the third one are future plans, right? And of course, Elizabeth Warren on the Democratic side was the mistress of future plans. I mean, she would have thousands of them, whatever the final number was. And that's what the campaigns are about. If you start to listen to candidates or go to their websites, that is 98% or more of what you will find that they write about, they talk about, they make videos about. And I said, God, is there not something that's missing here? And that's when I decided it was the 4th P to go along with platitudes, promises, and plans, all of which are very legitimate and credible to use in a campaign. But the 4th one is stories of progress. I mean, it is rare for a candidate to actually talk about stories of progress. And one of the poster child example of this that I often use, that to me is still the most striking one. Do you remember last September at CNN, there was 10 Democrats, the primary was down to, I think, 10 Democrats. And CNN gave each of those 10 30 to 40 minutes in a town hall environment, in an interview setting, to talk about climate change. Right? So you had about basically 300 to 400 minutes of Democrats talking about, presidential nominees talking about climate change. And what would be your guess of how many positive stories came out of those 300 to 400 minutes? Whatever your guess is, it's really low. It was frighteningly low. I watched all 10 of them. Right? Then I got really, obsessed by this thing. I printed out all the transcripts of what they had said. I went through the transcripts. And once in a while, particularly like Jay Inslee, would talk about what he was doing as the governor. But rarely would he talk about what was going on around renewable energy in general, or what was going on around climate change, or what was happening in other states, or what was happening around fulfilling the pledges around the Paris Agreement. It was none of that. And so it stepping back, it's like, my God, I would think that most average voters, if you listen to candidates, and again, it's not just Democrats, Republicans do it just as much, or libertarians, or whatever party, if you step back and listen, that these folks are talking about issues like climate, like renewable energy, like gun reform, like healthcare, like these days the pandemic. They're talking about it as if we have made zero progress in them. For a voter who doesn't follow these kinds of issues, right, who doesn't really care about them, which is most of the country doesn't really care about these issues, or follow them, that the message that comes through is, I have a promise, I have a plan, it'll only cost, in this case, $2 trillion or $5 trillion or whatever it will be. We're going to accomplish this, that, and everything else. Right? And the message basically is, we're at square one about this. rather than creating a case, a narrative that says, here is this, this, and this. Here's where we are on climate. Here's what we've done around energy. Here's we have 200 plus major multinational corporations that are committed to 100% renewable energy. Here's what's happening in India, where they've just planted, they got 2 million people rounded up, and they planted all these millions of trees. Here's what's happening here, there, and there. Here's what's happening with electric vehicles. Here are the 20 countries and cities that have already announced that by a certain date, the closest being 2025, they will ban the sale or the use of internal combustion engines in those jurisdictions. Here are the 70 plus countries, subnational regions as well as areas like the European Union that have already established carbon markets to reduce to basically add a tax to carbon, to reduce the amount of incentives for, in fact, impose penalties for companies and using high volumes of carbon in their products or extracting the oil, whatever it is. Right? There's all of this going on. And seem to me, I get excited when I read these stories. In fact, it's the only thing that basically keeps me sane about what's going on in the country. And every day I'm probably reading 10 to 20 of these stories, which gets into what the project is that I'm doing. And I'll turn to that in a minute. But does that make sense to you? I mean, it seems to me there's a logic to that there's another way that people get excited when they hear about progress.
Yeah, progress suggests sort of a linear progression, which I think there's stories of that too. But I've been thinking some more lately too about how we all start in the middle on things, whether it's ourselves, our communities, whatever projects we're looking at. I mean, rarely is there a blank page in life. So I feel like acknowledging that wherever we are, we're starting in the middle helps us know that there is history here and there is future here, and we need to orient ourselves first in order to move forward.
I was just going to say that I'm wondering if because of the way that people have to sort of, or maybe don't have to, but talk in sound bites and things, that one of the things about progress and stories is that it takes a little while. You have to have a minute to read something or listen to something. And I'm wondering if people connect themselves, some person would connect themselves to this idea. How I'm hoping that you'll say more about sort of how they fit it into their platform, so to speak. Like where will it fit, and how will they capture people long enough to tell a story?
Yep, we will. We'll get to that. Yeah. So once I decided for myself that I saw the reaction I have in my own body when I read these stories, right, compared to when I read Politico, The Hill, or USA Today, or Fox News, or whatever the big sites are, who rarely run these stories, right? And when I've talked to people about them, and I can see that their eyes widen and their jaws drop because they have not, given what they read and watch and listen to, they're not learning. They're not becoming acquainted with the amazing amount of stuff that is going on in this country and around the world to move us towards what I tend to think of as a safer, saner, more sustainable world, including this country, but much broader than this country, that there is so much positive stuff going on that people aren't aware of. And so most of the electorate seems to be in despair, scared, with good reason. But yet there's a whole other story that isn't being told as a way to excite voters, because I think in my experience, it actually works that way. So that was the genesis of this project called High Five News, which is the worst possible name of a project during a pandemic, right? Bad timing, really bad timing. So I want to show you a little bit about what the project is, and then talk about some of just what you just asked about. How can these stories be used by candidates or by support organizations? So let me see if I share my screen here. You all see this?
Yep, we see it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So this is High Five News,
Yeah.
and you can see this is the about page, and this is what we're after: shooting for the moon, creating a new narrative, energizing voters, and a big piece of this is crossing divides, because what the part of the rationale for this is that wherever everybody is on the political spectrum, there are lots of stories that people can relate to. Advances in healthcare, advances in the pandemic, advances in climate change, and to hopefully start rebuilding trust in our country and in each other. Because one way to look that I look at this election is, if either the Democrats sweep the White House, the Senate, and the House, or the Republicans do that, there will be political domination by one party or the other, which will lead to incredibly more polarization in the country. And if we have split government, in one way or another, it's going to lead to more polarization in the country. And so in some sense, no matter who wins this election, if it continues as it is, as a country, we're going to lose, because there'll be even more polarization and more danger and more vulnerability to the country. So that, to me, is that positive story is a way of crossing the red-blue divides and talking to other people by sharing these stories with them. So that's what we're about. And then how we do that is really on the home page here. That what we do is supply at no cost these stories. We're just starting out here. Stories and solutions to political campaigns and electoral organizations around what are probably the 6 or 8 key issues in the election. The ones you see there. There's probably a few. Gun reform's not on there. High cost of prescription drugs is not on there. Depending what the age group and voter group is, that people will be really interested in these issues. So what we've done is we've been collecting these stories. I've been collecting these stories for years because they have fascinated me. But basically, we're collecting them now and putting them into a database. And just to show you a piece of this. So these are the most recent stories that were added into the database. You can just take a look at some of them. The diversity of the stories, but they all fall into one of those 6 or 8 categories that what I think are the key voter issues. These are all the headlines of actual stories. And just last week, we crossed the 100-story milestone. We've now got about 110 or 115 stories in the database. And they all follow a very similar pattern. Each story is basically, there's a headline, the date of the story, there's a graphic to go with it, and 3 bullet points. And the first bullet point always is a 1-sentence summary of what the article or the story says. The second bullet point is always 2 or 3 benefits or impacts that are mentioned in the story, that come out of the story, whatever the headline was, it leads to these 2 or 3 positive impacts. And the third one is always, how does this story relate to something larger going on nationally or globally? Because often whether it's presented on the internet or presented on television or in print, rarely do stories give any kind of historical context or a broader context of how this story fits in to something that's going on in the world. And I know for myself, and I think it's generally true of people, we like to know how something in a moment in time fits into something much larger. So all these stories follow this template. And the idea here is, when we get probably another 100 stories. Then we turn on the filtering mechanism where candidates or organizations or individuals can filter these stories by either issue, like gun reform or healthcare or whatever. They can filter it by voter group, like if they're talking to seniors, they might want to focus on like high cost prescription drug stories. Or if talking to farmers, they might want to talk on soil regeneration or cattle, methane cattle solutions that are out there to reduce methane from cattle. Or they can filter it by location. So if somebody's campaigning in Missouri, they'll be able to filter Missouri stories or any combination of those. So that a campaign, whether a political campaign or an advocacy campaign, can very quickly get a sense of a number of these stories that are out there. And then we back that up with, if people want, the campaigns want, a series of services to essentially, the database we just talked about, to supplement all the stories. So if somebody wants research, like they're running, say, the 3rd district in Missouri, and they want to know about healthcare stories in the 3rd district, we can provide research for them, do that research. And these would probably be low-cost services. The stories themselves are free. Or providing documents. This is one I drafted for a political candidate a while back. And it was like 7 or 8 slides that could be turned into a 2-page leave behind material or put on a website, showing basically, here's the problem around prescription drugs, here's some of the consequences of it, here's are some of the positive steps that have been taken, like by various states, or what the federal government has done. Here's what I've done as a candidate in the past, and here's what I will do if elected. So there's a kind of a template there that candidates can use. And this is basically the speech coaching, the speech writing to help them analyze how they are doing their campaigns, if they are open to it. Probably the lower the level of campaign, the more likely they would be. Then higher levels, at this point, they've mostly got their teams in place. And then how do you reach candidates in the middle of a pandemic? This was somebody was running, in fact, Kathy, in your district, was running for the House last month, who lost. I got involved in the campaign in the last month. Somebody introduced me to him. Anyway, so that's the idea of using the stories and using the services that for then candidates to be able to then incorporate them in a variety of different ways. So does that make sense? Does that seem too far out, or? So this is the stage we're at right now, which is, okay, so we now have, what I said is the milestone of 100 stories in there. We're now past that. I've had 10 people who've been helping me they summarize the stories for me. They come up with drafts of the bullets. I do whatever editing. I find the graphic, and then I post it into the database. But now we're at this critical section because there are only 102 days till the election. So we're just about 3.5 months until the election, and it's going to tighten a lot as Trump gets his footing back. So how can we then reach out to network to campaigns and to electoral support organizations to get them to understand what the basis of this is, the power of positive stories to excite voters, and then the different ways that they can use them. So that's for the last piece in here that I wanted to just talk about and get your feedback. You might have others, because I'm just trying to develop this now. So for instance, here's Joe Biden's website. And Trump could be the same. He's using now at the presidential level here. So he's got this part about Joe's vision. Have any of you looked at Biden's website? Well, you're going to. Okay, so what he has, and the vision idea, he has bold ideas. How many do you think he has? How many bold ideas does Biden have? He has 43.
Thousands. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Almost 1,000. 43.
Too many for anybody to grab onto. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So then if we just, let's say, okay, so he's got 43. Terrific. Good going, Joe. Right. Your staff has put together this stuff. Now let's see what they look like. Right. So here's one. If we just take the very first one. So if we just scroll down, never mind trying to read this, but what do you notice about it? What strikes you first?
It's thick.
It's thick, right? It's all text.
There's too many words. No one's going to read that.
Yeah, this one, by the way, thank you for giving me the segue, the lead in here. This one is 11 pages long and 2,583 words, right? Just for comparison, the Gettysburg Address was 272 words. It didn't have a lot of positive stories, but it was basically 1/10 of what Joe's plan here is for this. And then if we just go one more, just to give you an idea, this is really the scary one. Where is it? This one. Okay, this is basically climate, clean energy and climate. You go down and down, and it just goes on and on and on. This one is actually 48 pages, 10,429 words, with not a single graphic or chart or table, right? And there are only 2 sections in it in which there are any positive stories listed at all. And one of those sections is strictly what came out of Obama, Biden, those years, what they did as an administration. Like 0 in terms of gains we were making around, I guess, stuff that I talked about before, just the transition to electric vehicles, the fact that we're now talking about million-mile batteries for electric vehicles, all of the things that could be included in here. Take out most of this crap and put it into, a few summary sentences about here's the problem, and then let's talk about here's where we are, here's what we're gaining, here's what the mayors have done, here's what the state of Ohio has done, here's what Apple has just done. Apple just announced that not only all of their operations, which are already 100% powered by renewable energy, but by 2030, their entire supply chain, which is enormous, thousands of companies around the world, their goal is that their entire supply chain will be zero carbon emissions in 10 years. Now that's an extraordinary goal that they have publicly put out there. Why isn't Biden talking about this or anybody else? So one way that these stories can be used, if a candidate said, look, we don't have the time, we don't have the staff to do this, that I or people I'm working with here could take some of these stories out of that database, trim down what he's got in here, and add those stories in. And that could be done again at any level. Okay, so that's one way that I see using these stories. Another is, let me show you an example here.
Harvey, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I'm loving what you're saying, and I've got like a million thoughts going through my head at once. But
Yeah.
what I keep coming back to is someone like, I mean, we're using Joe Biden, obviously.
Yeah.
There's thousands of candidates doing all different things.
Yeah.
What would make a candidate like Biden think, I mean, I get it psychologically, you give someone a feel-good story at the beginning of something like this, they go, oh my gosh, there is progress being made, it engages them, they read more, and then Biden can say, and here's how we're gonna build on things like this, right? But how does a candidate, and we'll stick with Biden, come around to wanting to include these curated stories in their information that they're putting out there in writing, since the stories didn't really come from them? Like, it didn't come from what they're doing or what they're going to do or what their team is doing, since so much of what politicians put out there is so narcissistic, right? It's always about this is what I've done, this is who I am, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's a good way to engage people, but that seems to be the track that politicians are stuck in. So how do you convince a politician that psychologically it makes more sense for them to lead with, here's a really engaging, heartening, uplifting story about this topic, and here's then how my campaign is going to kind of segue from this to what we're doing.
What I think is, particularly in this election, is that there are two ways that to convince a candidate, if we can get to the candidate, or get to the League of Women Voters, or get to organizations that have some skin in this election game. The first one is, if you can skim off some of Trump's support, some of the margins, by showing people who are typically Trump supporters that a Democrat understands the issues of what it's like to be a farmer these days, or can see how the climate impacts on their crops and their businesses, or to see what the impact of the tariffs are, and give people examples of ways that we're making progress in these areas, or seniors, because seniors voted for Trump basically in 2016. If many of them could see that there is progress that Democrats have supported in terms of high cost of prescription drugs, you can start to shrink the margins. And again, Trump particularly won by so few votes in 3 or 4 states, it could make a huge difference. And the second one is, you're not only trying to shrink his margin, but you want to expand your own base. And probably the biggest place to expand base these days is with younger voters, college age, if not in college, because they just don't vote very much. And many of them are having that feeling, you would know this with your daughter, probably to some degree, my God, I've lived through 9/11, I've lived through 2001 crash, I lived through the 2008 crash, now we're in the middle of a pandemic, and by the way, climate change is going to come along and wipe us all out anyway. That doesn't give much sense of a future. And look at all the plastic in the ocean. So you can take these stories and I've done some of this, put them together to say, look, here's all the things we're doing about climate change. We get a real shot at reversing global warming and reversing carbon emissions. We get a real shot. We are cleaning up the oceans around plastic. We are cleaning up the rivers. And let me show you some examples of this. If you can then excite younger people about there is a future, it isn't just bleak doom and gloom, then I think you can expand the base, and a candidate would be interested in that.
Okay, great.
Okay. So because we don't have a lot of time here, let me just quickly go through some of these others and see, how they strike you. There's a group, I really like this organization called One Vote at a Time. Do you know them? Anybody know them? Okay, this is a group of...
Harvey, say the name again.
One Vote at a Time. Yeah. And what they do, this is a group of, I think there's photographs here. This is a group of about 25 young women, videographers and filmmakers, right? Quite diverse, as you can see, just from who's there. So what they do is they go around, they did this in the last 2 elections, and they make what are essentially introductory videos for mostly local and state candidates. I think they've done some congressional candidates, but mostly they're local. So somebody give me a state, pick out a state. One of these states.
Oh, it's on the list, never mind.
Colorado, I'd have to talk.
Colorado, okay. Give me a Colorado. Okay, I guess we do. So I'll just pick one of these. I have no idea which one. Let's say here. This is 2 minutes. There's some shorter ones. But the point is, just because we're running out of time, I've watched like 30 of these videos. And I'm in conversation with one of the women that runs the organization. They do really good work. The videos are great. Let me tell you about my childhood. Here's how I got involved in politics. My father used to do this. I was a nurse. Now I care about healthcare. I want to do that for the district. They're all like 1.5 to 2.5 minutes. Of the 30 that I have watched, not one had one story, positive story, to tell voters that there's really a good chance we can make progress in healthcare or gun reform or whatever the issue is. So we're talking about, if you're going to make a 2-minute video, can you give me 20 seconds of your script to put together 2 or 3 very quick stories? They're not really, they're just the headlines of them, to let voters know that we're making progress about this, and I will continue to work on that. So that's the idea here. And again, the same idea works in the national campaigns or gubernatorial campaigns, but even at the state and local campaigns. Or another way we're using this is, there's an organization known, Public News Service. They're actually based here in Colorado. They've been around for 25 years, and what they do is they aggregate stories, mostly not positive stories. They're often problem stories, or legislatures thinking about doing this. But they have a distribution of hundreds and perhaps thousands of local newspapers and radio stations that either reprint their material, or they have an audio segment, like a 3-minute audio segment that they make as part of their daily work. They do really good work. And so I was in a conversation with them about a week ago to say, would you be willing, if I supply you with more positive stories related to the jurisdictions, they're in 37 states, would you be willing to incorporate more of those so they get to these rural newspapers and these rural radio stations? And what's she going to say? Of course, says, yes, you're going to do that work for us. So that's another example. Or there are groups like, where's this one here? I'm not sure where. There are groups like, any of you know the Optimist Daily or the Good News Network? There are organizations that usually 5 days a week, they send out a list of anywhere between 6 and 10 positive stories. They have people that aggregate them, they write summaries of them, they send them out. I get some of my stories from them. And there's a number of these kinds of organizations that are out there. They really do great stuff. But what they're not geared towards is taking their stories and using them more in a political way, or that a candidate could use. So part of what I'm in conversations with a few of these now, just getting started, is would you be willing, let's take some stories that you distribute more widely, that a candidate might see them and therefore use those stories. I mean, that's another way to use it. Then there's a group I'm talking to that does letter writing. Indivisible, if you know Indivisible, that group that formed after the last election. A lot of individual chapters do that. But there are a lot of other groups that do letter writing and they do op-eds. And so why not, if you look at the ones I've seen, almost never is there any kind of positive story. Why not include 1 or 2 of them to make your point about how we'll develop a plan and we'll be able to implement whatever the plan is. So that's another way to use it. Or for people to start even sending them out to their friends, right? Their own personal networks, whether by social media or however they would do that, email, to let people know that all these things are happening, to get people excited about this election. And the bottom line with all of that is to then find some ways to participate in this election and vote and get out the vote, get other people to vote. So that's the stage we're at with this right now, is to try and find those organizations and those groups who can use these stories. And there's lots of other ways to do them. We just don't have time for them. So I'd be interested, just go to quickly. Does this all make sense? I mean, it does to me, but you're my little focus group.
Harvey, what's coming to me are 2 things. One is that it's reminding me of a long time ago, I used to have a subscription to Yes Magazine, and I did it specifically so that I could hear something positive. It was kind of my offset of the news, and I haven't had that subscription for a long time. I'm not even sure why I let it drop, but I did. But what I guess is coming to me is that this almost requires the candidate to acknowledge themselves as a leader who understands that progress and change occurs by empowering a broader set of people to create the change.
Yeah.
And I think that is probably a shift. I mean, that would be a shift that I would look forward to and that I would be encouraged by. I do think that it's a pretty large shift for most candidates who want to say, I will do this thing for you, when the truth is that actually it does require their constituents and everybody to do it anyway. But we kind of know that from an intellectual perspective, but people don't approach it that way. And I would, for one, welcome a candidate, presidential or otherwise, who would acknowledge that stuff happens through empowerment as versus from an individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, what I feel like what we're talking about here is really a systemic change, changing how we even talk about these things. I mean, yeah, to Deborah's earlier question too, is how to convince a candidate that this is a worthy thing to do. I mean, yeah, it kind of takes all of us, I think, having these conversations. But yeah, probably incorporating these kinds of stories into our own conversations. I don't know. I'm a big believer that local change is probably the best change. Starting there, at least.
Well, just to give you one example. My one experience so far, because again, most of the time it took forever to get this website built and developers were behind and blah, blah, blah. But I hooked up with, and Kathy, you may remember that Kyle Tisdale was running in your district, right, which is my old district. And, sorry, wrong one. Here we go. So, I was in conversation with him. It was like a month left in the campaign. And one of the things we hooked up with was how to use some of these stories. So I very quickly, this is not particularly professional looking, but he just wanted something quickly. We put together this, essentially a special feature newsletter that would be sent out to his constituents, right? People who were interested on his mailing list or whatever mailing list he'd gotten. So there'd be this front piece here, who he is, and, he loves the people in New Mexico, blah, blah, blah. All those little platitudes that you have to put in a campaign. And then, where's this? Okay, then we set up 3 stories, right? 3 positive stories. The first one would be something outside New Mexico that might be of interest to people in the 3rd district, which includes Santa Fe, Taos, some really very rural areas as well. But there's also a large group of people who would be interested in, we think, in these kind of stories. So this is one we put in there. This is a story, again, outside New Mexico. Then there was the second one was a story inside New Mexico, but not necessarily in the 3rd district. And then the third one was an actual story related to the 3rd district. It's about a beef processor, as you can see there. And then the final slide in this was basically another marketing piece. Oh, it's not even on this one. Sorry. Oh, I see. This was the original, the front piece here. And that was what I just showed you as the back piece. So that's just one way. If there was time and he'd been able to send this out twice a week to constituents, and my job would have been to provide him with the stories. That was a way he could have built some of his constituency. So that's what we're looking at here, is ways to do that, to creatively come up. I mean, do any other ideas come to mind?
I'm wondering, Harvey, how you see these as things that help to bridge the gap, the polarization. I'm not sure if I'm connecting the dots. Like if I'm sitting at the dinner table with people and we're trying to have a conversation, how do you envision this kind of thing, like bringing up a story about some sort of progress? How does that connect to reducing our polarization? Help me connect those dots.
Yeah, what I think is if you take a story, I mean, let's talk about gun reform can be very controversial, as we know, but take a story about high cost of prescription drugs. And if you're sitting around talking to somebody who's worried about, and it comes out in the conversation, money's tight, they're worried, the cost of prescription drugs, what will this vaccine cost, right? It seems like we're never going to get the price of prescription drugs down. And you can start talking about what 12 or 14 different states have done already in terms of passing local legislation to allow the importation of drugs from Canada or from other countries. Okay? And you start to talk about what individual, some of the more progressive pharmaceutical companies are doing, or talk about some of the research that's going on around finding the vaccine for COVID, that people, I believe, it's been my experience, people then open up to have conversation about issues when they actually see some positive things that could influence them, could help them out, wherever they are in the political spectrum. And the same thing with, climate change, or, 1,000 stories. How many people have lost their homes in fires and floods in the last year? And rarely does that get tied to climate change. And if you can talk about, my God, what a difference it is making when you have, for instance, I'll go back to the example I used earlier, when you have over several hundred multinational corporations who are already implemented or are committed to 100% renewable energy. We got a shot at actually reducing carbon emissions in the next decade that will, protect your soils, protect your crops, keep your homes from being flooded out, reduce the risk of your homes being destroyed in a hurricane, or your insurance being raised because of a hurricane season. There are ways to, that's what I think, that people will be interested, they're conversation starters, to get people to actually start talking about things.
Is it perhaps that the specificity of the stories themselves have the potential to reach across sort of these political divides, or even beyond, the keywords that we're all familiar with? I mean, like you just said, the wildfires and people's homes and communities being destroyed, people might not connect that with climate change or what those effects are. But if you talk about the stories themselves, perhaps that creates a safe space for people to find common ground.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and there are things, for instance, one of the examples I like to use is the two fastest growing jobs in the next decade, between 2018 and 2028, according to the Bureau of Labor Standards, BLS, big government agency. The two fastest growing job categories are solar installers and wind turbine engineers. So with so many communities worried about jobs in the economy, and particularly if they're in the coal or one of the fossil fuel industries, the coal industry is collapsing very rapidly. Tammy Duckworth just introduced a bill into Congress to basically soften a transition for coal industry workers. That's really critically important. And if people who are in those industries or just looking for jobs can understand that, my God, I may be able to get a good paying job doing as a solar installer or wind and turbine engineer, whatever, that's terrific. That's another way to engage with people and then tie it to a candidate.
I think I've just been putting some together in my mind based on what Kathy and Kelly both said about bridging the divide. I don't remember who said it, but crossing those lines, right? There's so many words that are hot buttons for people, like climate change, right? That's like a hot button word. But saving your home from a wildfire is not a hot button word. Or ridiculously, masks or no masks, right, is a hot button word. But like a story I read yesterday about 2 types of drugs that they think will be pretty mainstream by January 2021, which will make it so that when people get sick with COVID, they're not going to get seriously ill. That is not a hot button word. So I think that, or a hot button headline, right? So I think that there's a way to take stories like you're saying, Harvey, and reach across the divide by coming at maybe hot button topics without using hot button words.
Yeah.
And coming around the back door with topics that affect everybody, regardless of even their value system or their belief system, that affect everybody, and that no one could say, oh no, I actually don't believe in that. Like, no one's going to say, oh, I don't believe in like, I don't really agree with the medication that's going to make people not die from COVID. Like, no one's going to say that. And so I think there's a way of taking stories and finessing how you bring them out into a conversation or out to a group of people that avoids the hot buttons, so that you get buy-in, because people say, oh, this is relevant to me personally, this is relevant to my family, this will make my life better, this isn't political. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does. I mean, that's what I'm hoping.
It's reminding me, I just want to interject that for some reason, what's coming up for me too is that I remember not that long ago, maybe not even 10 years ago, when there would be mayoral candidates for Kansas City or wherever. We didn't ever actually know what political party that person even was. It wasn't a thing that mayors were Democrat or Republican or something. It was always about the relevant issues in your city. And maybe they had different views, but they didn't tout it as a party. It wasn't a party thing. Now, we've heard over and over again, especially with the COVID thing, these certain Republican mayors or Democratic mayors or things like that. It's almost like if you can get to that issue, like Deborah's saying, that affects everyone. Sewers in Kansas City are old. We got a problem. That kind of thing. How you solve it may be the distinction between the candidates, but the idea of first acknowledging that there's a common ground seems to make sense to me.
In Kansas City, and here's some progress we've made, or here's what they did in Pittsburgh. Or if we go to I think it's the American Society of Civil Engineers, who every 3 or 4 years rate the country's infrastructure, and they rate it state by state, giving the country a D- basically. But they also list a lot of positive stories. And we said, we can find you stories of sewer improvements in other cities that you as the mayor can, or in a conversation, can use to move this along with people and get people excited about the momentum that we can do this. So anyway, I mean, that's really, this is where the stage we're at. And we'll see what happens with, the next 102 days.
I'm curious, Gwen, if some of what this is speaks to you in terms of your family dynamic. Does this what does this say to you about that?
To me personally, my family dynamic?
To Gwen's family dynamic.
Yeah, to my family issues. I don't know. I mean, it feels like that's how it used to be. Like that it was much more about like important social issues and how people come together. I don't know. There's a part of me, I'm this optimist, right? I'm a fundraiser in conservation. So I always see like this, there's possibilities, there's hope, there's optimism to do anything. But the tone just seems so different now that it's like, how do we move the needle bigger and faster? And the people who don't want to engage and focus kind of on that common ground, like I agree with everything that's been said here, that common ground is so important. But the ones who don't, like, it's kind of like the urgency right now to get solid leadership, and not just the United States political leadership. This is, global leadership? And how do we work with the UN, and who gets up on that stage, and who's going to really push those big economic needles kind of thing? I don't know, like I'm almost kind of in this zone of like, I'm comfortable not even bringing up political issues with my family. I just want to move on. Like it's a kind of a new way for me to be personally. And I think that's okay. You know, it's like kind of like accept people where they are and move on, instead of always finding like the people who are absorbed in social media like Facebook, or getting news bites that are just so like, you know, that opposition kind of thing with each other. So I don't know, we'll see. Maybe I'll test out some of these with my family and let you guys know later.
Good luck.
Thanks. I'll share these websites with them. And check these positive stories out. Watch CBS Sunday Morning. Listen to more podcasts that are focused on some positive solutions.
Well, feel comfortable to, you know, these stories are for everybody. If you to all of the stories. And if you come across any stories you think would be good in the database, please send them to me. Send me the link.
Okay.
And certainly, if you know, if you want in any ways to help out with the campaign, with this project, let me know, because you know, I really need people at this point, or outlets, or suggestions, or it's at that stage for these next 102 days. But you know, it's a way. You know, I was thinking about this earlier today. Uber came along and disrupted the entire service industry, taxi industry. Right? Netflix wiped out Blockbuster and all the other stores. When you have these massive disruptives in a business sector, this to me isn't a massive disruptor, because what I'm talking about is integrating a few of these stories within the platitudes, promises, and plans, the way a candidate usually does it. It's just introducing this kind of communications module that they don't usually do, or an advocacy group. So this doesn't feel as disruptive, but if it starts to take off, who knows, maybe it would be. Anyway, I want to thank you all for being part of this, and of course, Shadowcliff for hosting this. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Harvey, very much for providing this opportunity for all of us to hear what's going on for you, we will be sending out to everyone who's participated today, along with other folks in other Communiversity sessions. I hope you'll stay tuned for what else you might want to join that Shadowcliff is offering, but we'll send out some evaluations at some point soon and try to get some feedback about the structure, the format, the timing, what we've been doing. But this has been really good. You're really only the third in the series, Harvey. So thank you for being right on the front edge of this with us. We really appreciate that.
Sure. Next time I'll play the violin for you.
Thank you, Harvey. It was nice to meet you and learn from you. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you all for being part of it. I do really appreciate it. Okay.